Hello and welcome to today's webinar, From Chaos to Clarity, your guide to understanding and identifying CUI, presented by Neosystems, Peak InfoSec, and DTC Global. I'm Don Carnevale, Director of Marketing at Neosystems. I'll be the host for today's event. This is the second webinar in our five-part series entitled From Surviving to Thriving, the CMMC Enforcement Era Playbook. Please keep an eye out for invitations to future episodes coming soon. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A area within Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, we will make the webinar recording and presentation slides available to all registrants in the coming days. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Megan Kennett from Neosystems. Megan?
Thank you, Don, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Megan Kennett, Product Marketing Manager here at Neosystems, and I'm honored to host today's session From Chaos to Clarity, the CUI Playbook. CUI isn't hard because it's complex. It's hard because it's unclear. Today, we're going to bring clarity. Neosystems has spent over 23 years supporting government contractors in the real-world intersection of compliance, contracts, and cybersecurity. And today, I'm joined by three experts who bring policy, legal, risk perspectives, and implementation to help you move from surviving to thriving. Let's dive in. It is my privilege to welcome Reagan Edens, a dear friend and chair of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. He leads DTX Global. He's advised U.S. Cyber Command and the Department of Defense on CUI and CMMC strategy and has operationalized more than 3.5 billion in DoD and intelligence missions. Recently selected to speak at Davos 2026 on CMMC as a global framework, Reagan brings both policy insight and real-world execution. Reagan, welcome. Next up, we have Jim Goebel. Jim is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Peak InfoSec and a founding director and former board treasurer of the CMMC accreditation body, now the Cyber AB. He's a certified CMMC assessor, certified professional, provisional instructor, and the author of two leading books on controlled unclassified information, CUI Fundamentals and CUI Informed. Over the course of his career, Jim has advised organizations across the U.S. government, major defense contractors, and advanced technology firms, and is regularly called upon as a cybersecurity expert and thought leader. When it comes to understanding CUI from a legal, operational, and governance perspective, few bring the depth and clarity that Jim does. Jim, welcome.
Thanks, Megan.
Last but certainly not least, I'm pleased to introduce David Carlino, Chief Information Security Officer and Vice President of Product Development at Neosystems. David brings more than 20 years of experience securing organizations across industries, from fast-moving startups to complex enterprise environments. His expertise spans risk analysis, security control assessment, and building compliant, resilient security programs that actually work in the real world. At Neosystems, he leads product development while simultaneously ensuring our biggest ideas align with reality and NIST 800-171. David approaches CMMC through a practical, risk-based lens, helping organizations understand not just what's required, but how to manage risk when scope shifts and assumptions start to drift. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Next slide, please. All right. So before we dive in, we're going to run a short poll just to get to know our audience. So where do you fall in the supply chain? Just a short quiz. All right. All right, so you're probably not here because you've never heard of CUI or the definition of CUI, and our intent is not to bore you with too many low-level details or the foundations of CUI. today. We will follow up with some wonderful resources from our experts, so definitely stay with us. We're going to cover some of the basics, but if you're looking for more in-depth, please look for the email that we're going to send out after. We can follow up with additional resources. So today we've got experts to guide you from surviving to thriving, providing you with what you need to know in simple, straightforward terms. No future state, no what ifs. We're helping you identify CUI and ensuring you stay on track from identifying CUI, safeguarding, choosing the right architecture system, and operationalizing to support its life cycle. We're also going to help you understand why that's so important. All right, on to the next slide, please. All right, Reagan, in the plainest layman's terms possible, can you please explain what controlled unclassified information and controlled technical information is with a few examples of each?
Sure. So CUI is a number of different categories of information that requires to be controlled, requires to be restricted according to federal laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. That information is received or developed on behalf of the government in performance of a contract, in performance of a subcontract between the prime contractor and its tier supply chain. Now, within the manufacturing environment, which is really the focus for CMMC, is really about controlled technical information. That technical information, really, the focus of that is technical information, right? And there are five controlling definitions that are related to that. Technical information, configuration management, engineering information, and export controlled technical information. Those definitions and those descriptions and examples are all in a DoD policy called DoD Instruction 5230.24. And so that some examples of that, which I mentioned, also include ITAR and EAR information, are usually the things that manufacturers need to execute their statement of work. So think about it like this: the design, build to print, those engineering information, specifications, different types of designs, bill of materials, these process sheets, work instructions, and also operational manuals, maintenance manuals, and also that can also include quality information as well relative to unique specifications in the contract. So suffice to say that when you have technical information and it's unique, not commercial information, but unique to the military and space purpose, that's very likely to fall underneath numerous different types of examples that are in the DoD Instruction 5230.24. So when you have export controlled information and it's on a DoD contract, that export controlled information, when it is restricted, must also be handled as CUI as well. So you're going to receive CUI from a prime contractor. You're going to develop CUI in performance of your work. If you are a prime contractor, you're going to receive a statement of work, most likely from your prime, from the DoD, and you may receive guidance or you may not receive guidance relative to the performance of the work on what is or is not related to a security classification guide. In the end, though, it's the responsibility of the prime contractor and the supply chain to identify that CUI and to ensure it's properly identified and marked prior to sharing. And when you develop CUI, it's your responsibility to identify the category of CUI that it fits in and then ensure that it's properly marked and then it's safeguarded according to those requirements.
Thank you so much, Reagan.
You're welcome.
Excellent. All right. Next slide. When we talk about CUI in the real world, it's contract driven, it's contextual, and likely the type of CUI that you handle today may change over time. So this one's for you, David. From a risk management perspective, when we talk about a life cycle approach to CUI, what are we talking about, and why do contractors need to be thinking about this as they begin to build?
For Neosystems, we really preach the lifecycle approach. It comes from the NIST risk management framework. You see this in all the cybersecurity frameworks over time, secure lifecycle development. So with CUI data, it's not just the data, it's the systems it's processed on, and it's the tools you're going to use to protect it. And those things all change over time, both that you need different technology as technology changes, but also that the data that you're getting in performance of your contract changes. And you might not get, as Reagan mentioned, work instructions today. You might get them tomorrow, though. And the primes are pushing down or flowing down the CUI requirements saying, hey, in performance of contract, but that will change over time, especially for 3-year contracts, right? Technology is going to change, and the information they need to pass to you to perform will very likely change. So we see a lot of people trying to take CUI as a point in time type of adventure, and we would really advise you to be resilient in your design, to plan forward and think about things that may happen around printing. If you're building a cloud-only enclave, printing is going to be tough for you. So, kind of considering some of these handling requirements that are coming today, but are also going to come tomorrow, and how they might impact your architecture when it comes to planning. So we would really tell people, think about it as a life cycle, understand it's going to change. Often it starts small and spreads. And to not lose sight of the fact that once identified, you've achieved a goal, you need a continuous monitoring life cycle type approach to keep checking on your supply chain risk management as that's coming along. But to keep in front of it and make sure that you're planning into the future.
I love it.
David, can I add just one little bit on there? You were talking about the planning piece. The one of the really cool things about CMMC right now is if you are doing this and doing it well, you're positioning yourself to be ahead of a lot of your competitors, and that can actually open you up to new opportunities that you may not have thought about before. And so we talked a little bit about the ITAR information and EAR and other export controlled information. And that's one of those major factors that you want to consider right up front is, are you positioned, is your industry, and there are lots of them, are you positioned where you may actually wind up, even though you're not handling ITAR, EAR, or other export controlled information today, getting the CMMC certification may actually put you in line for that kind of work, and migrating from a platform that is not ready for that kind of export controlled up to something that is a non-trivial thing. So I think we talked about that the other day on our tag up call. Like, I think that's something really important for folks to think about, because sometimes you make short-sighted decisions that can be very expensive to deal with on the back end.
Absolutely. That's wonderful input there. Thank you. Thank you for chiming in, Jim. All right, next slide. All right, so I've heard Reagan on his Industry Standards Council and other events speak to the CUI program. This is, it's a really foundational element to understanding CUI and why we're safeguarding it today. We're here again to help you move from surviving to thriving, which are, so we're pointing out some of these key foundational elements to help you understand the background. Reagan, in 2 minutes or less, how exactly did we get here? And what are some of these authoritative resources, and why are they important?
Well, it started a long, long time ago. So in 2 minutes or less, the challenge really is that there have been and those of you who spent your career in DoD know this, there have been so many different variances in agencies' guidance and their requirements, and what they even call the types of information that is not quite classified, but it's not freely distributed amongst the public. And the FOIA requests in particular have been very difficult in navigating that, and what's releasable and what's not. So they developed this category called CUI, and it is ever growing. So what we originally started out with 2016 underneath the 13556 executive order has really grown, not exponentially, but it has grown quite substantially over this period of time. For most DoD contractors and NASA contractors, those related to space programs, the preponderance of the information is technical information, and that's subdivided into two categories, which we spoke about: contract controlled technical information and export controlled information. But there is in a very short order, we're going to be adopting privacy information. And if your people are a product, if that you provide services throughout the federal government as a prime or even as a subcontractor, then your people are the product, and their privacy information related to the performance of the contract is CUI, by the way, and will be more substantially and deliberately protected as CUI in the days to come. What's most important is that you understand that there are differences in the federal government's requirements and those that are unique to the DoD. So remember that the DoD, you are required to apply, according to 32 CFR 2002-14A4, you're required to apply DoD policy to your implementation of the NIST Standard 170 requirements and follow that guidance. So you're going to want to know what does the government, the DoD require us to handle control technical information? That's the reason we provided that instruction. How should I mark it? Well, NARA has a marking system, but the DoD has a more specific and deliberate marking system for their specific agency. So you're going to want to follow the DOPSR, which we list right there in the slide. That DOPSR is brand new. A lot of people don't even know. And the DoDCUI.mil is a great resource for you to find ever evolving documentation. The importance of that for you is this. There is no mystery about what CUI is because CUI, it qualifies in performance of the contract. So the DoD in this marking guidance says if your information that you receive or develop fits into a category of CUI, and when it does, it matches that category and description of CUI, then you mark it according to the DOPSR's requirements. So it's important that you realize that there's not going to be this very complex kabuki dance of DoD flying down to your location and helping you walk through what is and is not CUI. That is not the way this is working. And we see the migration of those responsibilities directly to the DIB. And that's we're going to clean that up with a FAR CUI rule in the future. But for now, it really boils down to something very fundamental and very principal, which is if the information that you send or receive in performance of your contract matches a category CUI described in the CUI registry, then it is CUI and you mark it and then you protect it accordingly.
Great. Thank you, Reagan. And information can still be CUI even if it's not marked.
Absolutely. So there's very specific provisions, and we won't get into the details of those, but they're numerous. And they say, look, if you have unmarked CUI, you have responsibility to identify the category CUI is and identify that those safeguards that are appropriate to that category of information. Now, you can send it back to the DoD if you're prime, but we all know at the speed of business that that's not reality. And certainly as a tier subcontractor, you can send it back to your prime and demand that they mark it. That's certainly their responsibility on paper. But in reality, that does not happen. It does. No one can wait for someone to answer that mail. So in the end, yeah, it is your responsibility to ensure that before you share that CUI internally, that you understand the category that it fits into and that it is properly marked, whether you do it yourself or whether you rely on the sender or the recipient. Specifically, though, that the DoD has recognized that subcontractors and primes will develop far more CUI than they will ever receive. So it is your incumbent responsibility related to that to understand the derivative or what they call secondary CUI that is developed in performance of the contract and that you'll share to your subcontractors and to your tiers. So it's necessary that you realize that the one single document that you receive is not the only CUI. It is the tip of the spear, and that's likely to be distributed in a manufacturing environment throughout the entire organization.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to move on now to types of CUI. Jim, I love how you describe this. You've always helped me understand this. Would you mind giving a real quick overview of the difference between CUI basic and CUI specified?
Sure. So as Reagan mentioned early on, the thing that makes information CUI is not the category description, right? It's actually the corresponding law, regulation, or government policy. There has to be a law, regulation, or government policy that says that the information can or must be safeguarded or subject to limited dissemination controls. That's fundamentally what the definition of CUI is. And then when they're creating those laws and regulations and government policies, the people writing them tend to be a little lazy, and they recognize that making changes to those things can take a long time. So they just say, hey, this needs to be protected. They don't describe how. The difference between what a CUI basic and CUI specified is if the person writing that regulation or that law actually took the time to say this is how, that is, they specify how the information needs to be protected, then it's CUI specified. Otherwise, if the regulation, law, whatever, just says the information needs to be protected, but it doesn't say how, it's CUI basic. That's it. It's not real rocket science. It's actually pretty straightforward.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. All right. We already talked a little bit about the 32 CFR Part 2002 program. So we're gonna breeze by that one. Really, this is where, this is where it all comes from. So if you haven't read this, I highly recommend you take a look, or we've got a couple experts on the call here that can help you too. So let's move on to controlling the flow of CUI. Oh, and by the way, controlling the flow of CUI is one of the requirements in NIST, but it's important for a number of other reasons too. So
Yeah.
back over to you, Reagan. Why is controlling the flow of CUI so important? And how do you go about finding CUI in your organization?
Yeah. So this, many people don't realize that this is really the cornerstone for all the requirements. Because in the end, what you see on your screen is control the flow of CUI in accordance with approved authorizations. Those authorizations, as Jim described, are the specified requirements that are necessary to protect the information. And within the DoD in particular, and the DFAR 7012 and 7019, 7020, and also underneath the new class deviation, the specified requirements are delineated in DoD policy. Okay. So if you read NARA, it explains that the DoD instruction 5230.24 gives you that guidance, and that's where you should look. So when you control the flow of CUI in accordance with those approved authorizations, what you need to know is where can the CUI, where is it permitted to flow, and where is not permitted to flow. And so everyone in my organization is not allowed to access the information just because I like it or just because I want to. The DoD narrows that environment to the scope according to the scope of your duties in DoD Instruction 8582.01. So that lawful government purpose, I'm performing the contract, it's within the scope according to my duties, narrows the scope on which the CUI is permitted to flow. And I also have to meet those prerequisites. Am I trained? Have I had my security review, right? That's also required in the NIST Standard 171. So as we define that and narrow the environment where CUI is permitted to flow, then that helps us define our scope. Okay. And in defining our scope is everything, because the scope of the CUI is everywhere that CUI does flow in the performance of the contract, but only where it is permitted to flow. And so what we end up doing is we end up looking at that and taking what we call it a CUI discovery process and identifying the flow of CUI where it is right now, whether it's permitted or not, and then altering that river, right, where the CUI is permitted to flow, and then adding resources that are appropriate and compliant according to CMC requirements in NIST Standard 171. So this is the defining cornerstone. And many people don't realize that all of the requirements apply to CUI, whether it's specifically identified in the language of the requirement. All of NIST Standard 171 applies to CUI and flow of CUI. So as we look at the flow, then we begin to narrow the environment in relative to the contract performance, and then that's when we begin to apply the rest of the controls.
I want to harp on two things that came out of what Reagan was saying there, that this starts with your contractual obligations and the approved authorizations in the law, and then you move on to the people and their role in touching it. And most people think of this IT first. And I think this control exemplifies that it is the cornerstone. It is where you start. It starts at a contractual promise. It moves directly to what kind of people are involved in delivery of this promise, and technology kind of comes along third. And I think that is oftentimes missed when people are saying, well, this is how we do it today. And they don't know to go back and check how they promised to do it and what authorizations and dissemination statements are really governing it. So it really sets the stage for start with the contract, start with understanding authorizations, and move toward roles, responsibilities, and technology second.
Just to amplify what David just said, it's very insightful and very important for people to recognize that probably I would estimate that 60% of the organization who are the CUI stakeholders are not IT at all. In fact, they're the people who receive CUI, develop CUI, and performance of the contract. And IT, given the appropriate resources and knowledge, can secure the data, but they do not own the data. It is the CUI stakeholders who are in the workflow, on the manufacturing floor, in the design, in the relationship to quality, and all the parts and pieces of production. All of those components work together to ensure that exactly what David said is true, that the flow of CUI is executed according to the authorized permissions, and then the IT structure is aligned to the performance of that workflow.
Great. All right. No, that's those are wonderful perspectives. I appreciate both of you. We're going to move on to the next slide, and we've spent some wonderful time sharing some of the basics of what CUI is and the types of CUI that exist and some of the foundational resources to help this audience understand why it's important to protect it. But what happens when CUI shows up unmarked? Well, I am happy to share a secret weapon and winning formula, that I've used for years. Neosystems has incorporated it with our clients to help them move from surviving to thriving. But essentially, if you can answer yes to all three of these questions, then there's a really good chance that it could be CUI and should be treated and protected as such. So obviously, if you have questions, there's professionals out there who this is what they do for a living and can help. Two of them are on this call, but definitely look at the registry and NARA, the definitions, and if do your due diligence. But the 1, 2, 3 punch, number one is the information not intended for public release. 2, are you providing a product or service to the government under a contract? And then 3, does the information meet at least one of the laws and CUI definitions in the CUI NARA registry? Very helpful. If you can answer yes to all those, then there's a good chance it's CUI. Anything that Reagan or Jim would like to add to this?
Yeah, I think that only one thing I'll add is that the clarity of the specificity of that in the numerous examples, right? Like people often ask me, I've literally looked at thousands of examples, potential examples of CUI, but within manufacturing, it is all of the numerous suspects are parts CUI and parts numbers. Well, yeah, they certainly can be, right? Bill of materials, absolutely. If it's in relationship and meets the criteria, a relationship to a D47012 contract, and it's unique to the military and space application according to the definition. So these things, when we're looking for examples, I would, when it's technical information, always go to the DoD instruction 5230.24. In the very first several paragraphs, it will explain the applicability. It will explain the examples, and you cannot go wrong. You cannot go wrong. And then when you're looking to, if I identified a CUI, then how do I mark it? Then go to the CUI Marking Training Aid, which is the December 2024 release. Do not go to the earlier version because it's entirely different. It's entirely different.
No doubt too. The goal for most people is to get you close. If this is not your expertise and you get close and you're starting to look like it, smell like it, we really would advise you to work with people like Jim and Reagan. The getting it correct is your goal. Being close to correct is not really the goal. So these are great. This is a great set of advice for you to understand. It's not public. It is related to delivery of a contract. And it looks like it's in this definitions and categories, so I'm probably going to call for help. Unless this is your expertise and you've spent quite a while doing it, the chance of getting it perfectly correct on your first go is pretty low. So we would, if you're saying yes to 1, 2, and 3 here, you're likely en route to calling some legal help or contractual help, depending on where your questions are.
Thank you, David. Okay, moving on. We've spent time talking about what it is, how to identify, understanding its flow, life cycle, scoping, Reagan covered, and scoping is I think it's the most important part as you're preparing for an assessment. Identifying the people, processes, technologies, and services that come into contact with CUI. It really is, it's a combination of IT and the business to properly scope. David, what's a best practice, looking at Neosystems approach to managing, assets and identifying and categorizing them throughout the life cycle. What are some best practices that you've adhered to?
I think we spoke to the concept of start with your promises and contract, start with your people involved and your mission and your system function. And then you're getting down to the component level when you start to talk about categorizing each asset, each person, each system, each workstation, each printer. Do you need to do keyboards? Probably not. But getting down to the component level is where you really rubber meets the road with these designations. So you start out at this kind of abstract level, you kind of focus into more of your mission, and then you start to really get down to the component level where you're categorizing each individual item. You're doing this typically in an inventory, a component inventory. And so you're wanting and you're trying to work toward which ones are CUI. That's the wrong direction. You're starting with where did I make promises? Where's my data? Who touches it? On what systems? So I think it's tempting for people to look at asset categorization as where to start. And they think of it as, again, an IT problem because IT can make you the asset inventory typically. HR makes you the personnel inventory, which is also assets. Your building access control folks will give you your facility information, which is also assets. Your contracts folks will give you external service provider offerings and cloud service provider offerings, also assets. So I think people think of this assets as I'll start here, I'll just write them all down and I'll start marking them off. And that's pretty far off. You really are starting with which contracts, which people work on those contracts, which systems are involved, and then you're down to the nitty-gritty of is it a CUI asset, a protection asset, uh, inside the boundary, but not either of those first two, or some kind of specialized asset that may or may not handle CUI and performance of contracts, GFE or technology that maybe you've sent to space and the government saying, don't ever touch that again, just in case we need to patch it. Don't touch it, right? So it's not going to get patching. It's not going to get a whole bunch of things, but the government wants you to keep this system. So specialized assets, there's lots of types of them and be aware what they are. But, this is sort of the final destination, not really the starting point.
Thank you. That was great. And of course, the 32 CFR Part 178 also provides this beautiful matrix with wonderful details that you do need a magnifying glass to read. So please take a look at that if you have any other questions on that. All right, moving on. All right, we're looking at the order of operations now, from getting the scope right to managing the CUI lifecycle to future proofing. What are some tips? I'm going to tee this one up to you, Jim, because you have a really great program that has been published and loved by many. Would you mind sharing some tips and tricks to ensure our audience is heading down the right path?
Sure. So we created what we call the 12-step program. We recognize that getting CMMC compliant sometimes can take a lot of therapy. In fact, I run a nonprofit. The nonprofit does CMMC group therapy. So we kind of take a tongue-in-cheek approach to this. We know that this is not easy. And so we created a 12-step program to try to get you ready for your CMMC certification. And the first step of it, as David was just saying, is really understanding what CUI do you have? What information do you have in your environment? And that includes not only the CUI, but also FCI. Everybody tends to focus on the fact that you need to be CMMC compliant for handling CUI. It's level 2, you get your CMMC certification, blah, blah, blah. But there's also that FCI piece, the federal contract information, the other non-public. It's not covered by a law, regulation, or government policy, but it's also not classified and it's not intended for public release. There's that other set of information that also has to be protected. Don't forget about that. So as you do your inventory, you're looking for CUI, FCI, and while you're at it, you may as well look for things like your employees' personally identifiable information and other sensitive information. Make sure you're putting that in an environment that's actually designed to secure it. And the environment that you're building for your CMMC Level 2 certification is a good place to start. So those kinds of things, just laying that foundational information, understanding what you have in your environment, and then how it flows. So David talked about the assets, and I completely agree. All the stuff that he rattled off is exactly what you need to know. What we find, though, is that when people do those asset inventories and they look at where is my CUI, they look at it as a snapshot in time, and they don't realize that it actually flows from where it is, where you found it, to 6 other people in the organization, and they all happen to have copies of it too. There's lots of other issues that come in here, so make sure you're looking at how did it come into the organization, who touches it, where does it move just internally, and then how does it leave? Because there are lots of different ways that information can, again, come in, leave. It can come in through email. It can come in through a lot of different systems. You need to make sure that you're understanding what all of that looks like, because that feeds into those asset categorizations that we were just talking about on the previous slide. So you need to lay a really strong foundation. If you don't have that basic information, as we were saying in the previous slide, that's your scope. That is the stuff that's going to be assessed. And where we find many organizations stub their toes is they come to us, they think they're ready for an assessment, and we literally start asking just a handful of questions about what cloud services do you use, and do those cloud services actually handle CUI, and what do they do, what's their role? And all of a sudden they're not ready for their assessment. They've realized that, oh wow, we missed a whole bunch of stuff. So taking your time, really looking at and building out that CUI inventory and FCI inventory, as well as all of those asset categories, they lay the foundation for everything you need to make sure you're doing that. And then that also helps you build that CUI lifecycle, really understanding how you're going to manage everything from start to finish, because again, that's how it flows through the organization. And we talked about future proofing, trying to make sure that you're ready for where your system needs to go and where you as a business are going to go, because you're going to make significant investments to get ready for CMMC. And the cost to move to different platforms to make significant changes, there's a whole issue with making significant changes to your environment. You have to get reassessed in some cases. So there's lots of things to think about as you're designing things in. Strongly encourage you reach out to a C3PAO, get a sense for what they would consider to be the a significant change so that you can plan appropriately.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Those were really great points, and I agree with you 100%
I want
on
to
that.
echo Jim's comments from when we were chatting before on this topic, that for many businesses right now, you may not have ITAR data, for instance. So you're going to build into GCC, some kind of, not the US sovereign cloud, if you will. Your competitors maybe are doing the same. You are looking at this thinking, yeah, this is probably getting into the category of future export controlled, though. The government's not looking to decrease the amount of information they keep in the US, but mostly increase it. So if you're in an industry that's right on the line right now, and it's not currently coming to you as EAR or ITAR, export control, but you prep for this and you build it into your system and your design, you're ready and way ahead of your competitors in a direction that is not easy to pivot to. So future proofing in terms of thinking about it, I don't want to get caught not ready, but also noting as a business that these kinds of preparations put you on the front foot. The government doesn't call the community when they decide to make data ITAR or not. If they change their mind about it and you're caught in the crosshairs and you haven't thought about that, moving from a whole system designed to handle export controlled data, or one that's not, to a system that is designed that way is not a small lift, and really can take time for a whole industry to refab. So if you're ahead of the game there, that's a good position to be in as a company.
Thank you so much, David. All right. Tying it all together, clearly operationalizing a system to protect CUI, there's a lot that's involved. Everything, I mean, we talked a little bit about just, the legal aspects, the policies, the systems to protect that is what we're moving into now. When it comes to securing CUI in its current state and then protecting it into the future, what are, we're looking at solution technology needed to secure the mission. Is that something, David, how would you address that? What are some things that our audience should consider?
I think the I'm not even going to say that again. To make your environment operate correctly, you probably are thinking about technology in a what I like to think of as like a fiefdom, fully operational system. So you can't have some missing parts and pieces. So identity management is probably step one. What is your identity management solution looking like? Most people need an endpoint of some sort. So what is your endpoint solution going to look like? Are people on phones? Are they on cloud PCs? And then typically, what is your network looking like? Are you able to be a zero trust endpoint to secure cloud type of a solution? Or is there going to be a facility with a perimeter based kind of a model wrapped around it? Are you going to be in a hybrid design where you're perimeter on-prem and cloud first for your zero trust build? So looking at what tech you typically need, you need accounts, you need devices, you probably need cloud services. So from a starting point, figuring out that there's just not that many ways through this maze, not many people make operating systems for endpoints, very few, in fact. And those people that make them only offer them in certain configurations that become compliant. So if you're off looking at untested, not the typical products named in this category for people who are doing it, those kinds of solutions and technology, unless you're the kind of bleeding edge, lots of R&D, willing to take risk kind of company, you're probably settling in on the tried and true architectures that come with the known cloud service providers and endpoints that are available. So um, start with your mission. Don't kind of get all that creative with the tech and solutions right now. It's a burgeoning industry. There's not a million technology solutions. There's just probably 5, 10 out there realistically that get through the maze. So pare down, slim down, and use the tech that exists to fit your needs. Not really the other way around.
Thank you, David. And I do want to give Reagan a few seconds to talk about this the authorized FedRAMP, authorized cloud services to support a sustainable CUI program, GCC High. What are you seeing? What would you consider to be something important to not look over?
Yeah. So the very first and most important aspect of this is guidance from a reputable source that knows what they're doing, right? There's nothing worse than undoing the work of others. It is hard, it is expensive, it is hard on the organization. And for whatever reason, I've become a specialist in this. And the reality is if you get good guidance, you make good decisions and you make good investments in technology. And that includes where are you going to use an enclave? Does the scope of CUI really flow throughout your 100% of your revenue? Is it 80%? Is it 60%? How is that managed on your production floor, or what products and services do you provide? So, making a choice about being all in versus a CUI enclave is a very, very important choice. Also, what services that you access with regards to your ERP or with regards to your other cloud applications. You need to know whether or not that technical data or other categories of CUI are processed, stored, or transmitted within that environment. ERPs are notorious for encompassing CUI. Why? Because part numbers and bills of material and other things in a well-integrated CRP, and then now you're with a very daunting challenge of to navigating that into a FedRAMP authorized environment or taking extraordinary steps in order to work around those requirements. In the end, choosing correctly or choosing the first time with an informed decision about what the next plan of action needs to be is all led by good guidance and really looking at a careful review of what David said. What types of CUI do you have? Where does it flow? What's encompassed within those requirements? Where's it permitted to go? Who's not allowed to access that CUI? And then what business services and applications are either on-prem or in the cloud, and then choosing those right providers that can give you the guidance that you need and outside consultants to really succeed here.
I literally just had a call earlier today with somebody who their business team said, X, this is what we're doing today, and this is what we want to build to. Great. And then, so they built their environment, and then that was on-prem. And then they realized that everybody hated it for lots of different reasons. And so they migrated to one cloud service solution that was sort of cloud in a box type of approach for CMMC compliance. And I'm not knocking that. There, for a lot of companies, those work really well. But for this company, all of a sudden, there was another business need because they didn't talk about where do we want to be in 6 months or 2 years. And all of a sudden, they decided they wanted to embrace AI. And the cloud in a box couldn't handle AI. So they had to migrate yet again. So 3 times they moved, or sorry, 2 times they moved over the past 3 years from one platform to another. And it's painful. It's all these things. It's painful. It's expensive. It's distracting. Take the time, as Reagan said, talk to experts who will actually tease out some of that information and help you make smarter decisions long term.
I think
Fantastic.
a good stepping stone too for a lot of companies is to build an enclave that you may move into one day. It gives you a sense of what the heck GCC High is like. What are computers that are got a secure configuration going to work with and not work with? So it gets you into an environment that can conceivably solve your problems before you've made your whole company commit to it, so that you can get a sense of, okay, does the Microsoft Forms, does it work the same in GCC High? Can I use it for training like I do today? Some of those things work great. Some of them don't exist in GCC High, and you might have to think about different business processes that maybe don't use some of the registered applications that you're used to using for third-party integrations in your GCC High tenant. So we do typically see success with building out a small enclave. They're not terribly expensive for a small user base. It gets you moving on a system security plan and thinking about procedures without necessarily going full bore. But I generally think that, it's slippery slope. And if you build an enclave, as we just mentioned, that really should have been an enterprise system due to the sprawl of data flow, um, you then are either moving into your enclave or you're recalibrating, which gets expensive every time.
Wonderful. All right. We are almost to, or we're at the mark. We need to wrap things up here. So we have a wonderful slide on authoritative sources that we will publish and share with everybody after the call. One thing I want to look at, I want to open it up for questions, of course, but looking across the life cycle of CUI, there's so much to consider. There's so many moving parts, nuances, laws, scoping. It's very important that when you go out and work with somebody, that you are working with somebody who is qualified and, dare I say, CMMC level 2 certified if they are an MSP, to help you reduce your risk and move from surviving to thriving. And yes, I say that fully aware that I'm representing one, but again, it is a partnership and it requires good communication up front, knowing the language, and then of course, choosing a system and a workflow that you can that operationalizes and empowers your team for success. With that being said, I think we should go ahead and open up the questions since we are running up on the time.
Megan, before you do that, I do want to echo from a C3PO's perspective. I want to echo what you said, because we see a lot of small businesses that are using their existing IT service provider, which is fine. However, if you're not playing with somebody who knows the CMMC space, that creates lots of issues. They may not even realize that they are going to be in scope for the assessments, that their services and their environment may wind up being in scope, and that increases your cost. It increases all these other things. Using a trusted service provider who is CMMC certified can simplify things significantly for you. Makes our lives easier as the C3PAO. It makes it's kind of a smart thing for folks to be looking at.
Yeah, and I could say from experience for Neosystems, we had to go through some DIBCAC, mandatory DIBCAC assessments before Neosystems was able to go and get our CMMC level 2 certification. So we were part of the DIBCAC assessment, exactly like Jim just said. They wanted to look at our customer, they wanted to look at us, because we could not prove that our system was yet validated and certified. Doing an assessment of 2 systems at one time with 2 different companies is very, very hard to do. We knew what we were doing. We felt our docs were good. It's just so hard to look at one plan, then another, and get 220 controls correct, 640 assessment objectives correct. It's incredibly painful, even if it's just 2 companies. So if you're looking at, I have an MSP here and an MSP there, and they're not CMMC certified, now you're 3 times 320, right? So the problem grows exponentially with each vendor you're trying to work with in your environment that's handling CUI but's not CMMC compliant. So that has been a painful experience. I would say for Neosystems and our designs, we get along great with IT people that work for your company, especially for the last mile end user support or hands-on support in an office or facility support. There's not, I don't see MSPs as completely replacing all IT folks. That's not the goal. There's still plenty of IT to be done locally and with users, and the unique to your business part. So while I do think it's critically important that you work with people who have certification, typically we do think that it's good for you to keep your trusted IT folks around as well, that they're still going to help with users and devices and all the kind of the churn that is IT.
Wonderful.
All right,
All right.
so we've gotten some questions, and we had gotten a few questions in when people registered. So we're going to go through a couple of those quickly in the time we have remaining. Jim, I think this first question is right up your alley. Are you seeing any DIB companies telling you that they have been prevented from bidding on contracts or have lost business because they're not CMMC compliant?
Would help if I could find the mute button quickly. So the short answer is no, because CMMC requirements are not in contracts yet. So we haven't seen any contracts awarded that actually have the CMMC requirements in them. However, so that's at the prime contractor level. However, many of the prime contractors, when they're making business decisions today as to who's going to be on their team for certain things, they are already starting to weed out some of the subcontractors who are not handling and not ready for CMMC. You're probably getting questionnaires from those in your supply chain, higher up in the supply chain, who are asking you, what's your SPURS score? When do you expect to be done? When do you expect to have your CMMC certification? All that stuff. And that is exactly why they are starting to try to make these business decisions, these risk-based business decisions now, so they know that they are ready to go forward with these contracts going forward.
Yeah, I'll add to that I have a client, a space client, and they were part of the early rollout for priority systems, and they already do have a 7021 clause. So the challenge is meeting those requirements, and they have they're navigating that process in order to meet the CMC Phase One affirmation requirements. So they're real. It's happening. I happen to be right in the middle of that, and we are seeing the challenges in supply chains and subcontractors. And so remember that it's not just the prime, it's not just that tier subcontractor, but it is the outsourced supply chain when it's relative and meets requirements relative to sharing and developing CUI. So it's real. It's happening.
All right, Reagan, this question I think is right up your alley. What are some examples of what accountants handle that could be considered CUI?
So yeah, so this is an interesting problem set. So generally speaking, when accounts are executing, they're executing transactional information, right? So when that transactional information and the preponderance of that is going to be or should be FCI, federal contract information. However, we often make a mistake in understanding how we entangle CUI in transactional information in specifically in within the manufacturing. So if I put my specifications, technical data that's often incorporated into a purchase order or into a document related to that purchase order. Remember when you combine that technical information that's described in DoD Instruction 5230.24 with your transactional data, like a purchase order or a contract. Now, what does that happen after the D4 7012 has been awarded? And could be certainly could incorporate the 7021 like my client in space. Now, if I include and attach those documents as an accountant or in pair or in related to purchasing or various different transactional roles that accountants fill. If I combine those two documents together, now I have CUI and I need to handle that in an appropriate manner. So what I recommend to accounting firms and also that finance section of companies is that you need to separate those documents. Keep the transactional information transactional, and then keep the and then related to the contract. So transactional information in itself is an FCI, but when you have transactional information in accordance with information that's not publicly available relative to the contract, that's not technical, then now you can certainly get into that sphere, but separate that from the CUI and the technical information, and then send that in an appropriate pathway, and then let the purchase order just be the purchase order. It's just a transactional document. It doesn't have any contract information relative to just maybe obviously the contract or whatever. Let that document flow, and that's not FCI. It's just a transactional document, and then make different pathways. One for FCI that's appropriate to the requirements there for CMC level 1, and then CUI sending it through compliant pathways that's appropriate for CMC level 2.
And it gets more interesting when you start talking about lawyers and other professional service
Oh, yeah.
providers too, because if you read DFAR 7012 and some of the other requirements, there is a requirement that you flow down all of these compliance needs to those entities. However, that goes to your subcontractors. So lawyers, accountants often are not subcontractors on that contract. So what do you do? How do you handle this? There's an interesting gray area in all of that. To Reagan's point, if you're going to be giving them CUI, you really need to make sure that they are able to handle that CUI, and ideally, you're making sure that they have a CMMC certification for their environment. Especially when you get to lawyers, you're giving them usually the copy of that information. There are some techniques that you can use for making that information accessible to them. So things like virtual desktop interfaces and other things where you can share that information, you can lock it down so they can't make copies of it, et cetera, but they can read, review, and then they can analyze on their own systems and hopefully not bring the CUI into their system. So there are some things that you could do, but it's going to force a rethink of the way that we do business. I completely agree with Reagan. You need to start being very sensitive to what information you have and again how it flows through your organization, and not only those internal folks and the folks in your supply chain, but those other service providers, those professional service providers. How are you interfacing with them too?
Yeah.
Oh, note around accounting systems, cost point. We see a lot of people with cost point hooked up to TIP-QA, for instance. TIP-QA, your quality system, often has CUI in it due to the nature of your quality assurance systems. So if you can keep it out of cost point and in TIP-QA, that can help. If you use cost point, you can often put your data in SharePoint, or to keep it out of your cost point system as well through the integrations that cost points build out with SharePoint. So consider how you can use your tool set to your advantage in keeping that data separate so that the metadata is flowing together, but the CUI data is not in it.
Yeah. Contextually, just to address that, Jim's right on the nuances there, and that's important nuance. But the policy and the 7021 begin to constrict those nuances when we talk about the fact that it is required that all systems that process, store, transmit CUI relative to the performance of the contract, right, and relative to the authorized holders whom you share CUI with, they have to, those authorized holders must meet requirements according to NIST standard 171 and 32 CFR 202. So if I am underneath the 7021, I can't have a network that process, stores, or transmits CUI that does not meet requirements relative to CMMC in the 7021 clause.
Yeah, there's a little more nuance in there when you start looking at it from a legal perspective, but
Sure.
fundamentally, yeah, you need to know where that information is going, and you do need to make sure that they are able to handle, is the way that the 32 CFR 2002 says, that they're able to handle CUI appropriately. So
That's right.
We
yeah,
have one more question I wanted to ask that was related to our conversation from earlier about the 1, 2, 3. So Michael, somebody asked, is flowdown data that has been scrubbed, sanitized, considered CUI? If you can answer yes to the 3 questions that we had.
I would readily say that it's very unlikely that you scrubbed or sanitized the information if you're answering yes to those 3 questions. So remember that
But it could be your intellectual property. So do be careful between intellectual property and CUI data.
Yeah, remember that CUI does not differentiate between rights to technical data, right? That's covered underneath something called the 7013. So it's important that you recognize the fact that as you do something for the DoD or NASA or another related agency, that you can be creating something that is your intellectual property and that is also encompassed and controlled as CUI if you're doing that in performance of the DoD contracts.
Thank you, Reagan.
Yeah.
And thank you, Thanks to everybody for joining us. Really appreciate having you guys here and on, and everybody that attended today. We'll certainly follow up with some more resources. And please join us for future episodes of Surviving to Thriving.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.